Good morning, Dog Nation. I'm Brandon Adams, and this is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented today by Serve Pro. We are loaded, ready to go with you here today. That means Jake Fromm later on. That's always great. Connor Riley today to kind of get the perspective on everything happening around Georgia. That's important. Speaking of that, new information on a story we covered for you yesterday. Five-star quarterback Jared Curtis. We now have more info about when the next time he'll be at UGA is and kind of what that means for the overall pursuit for Georgia, kind of battling Oregon here. We'll kind of get into that. And also, off the top of the show today, and I do think we should take this somewhat seriously, a little bit of a word of warning to Georgia and perhaps Georgia fans about, for those hoping for a big step forward from Georgia this year on kind of both sides of the ball, why that is not necessarily a guarantee. I don't mean to be a wet blanket, but I do believe some days it's important to just sort of make you aware of all the news that's out there, whether it be what we want to hear or perhaps some cases not exactly what we want to hear. So let's cover all of that right now. I'll try to give you all sides, every perspective of this too. So we think it's going to be a good show and very much worth your time. It is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented today by Serve Pro. And it begins right now.
Today's episode of DawgNation Daily is brought to you by Serve Pro. Cleaning, restoration, construction.
Presented by DawgNation.com. This is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans. Here's your host, Brandon Adams.
There's one thing I take some pride in. Of all the shows we have for you here around DawgNation, I would say I am the one that's the most interactive in the fact that I'm reading my comments on a regular basis. I'm responding to my comments. Now, most of that is sort of contained in a little period of time before the show begins, and then a little bit of a period of time after the show is over. Most of that is when the commentary part of our show takes place. I try not to look at the comments too much while I'm doing the show because, frankly, I have a sort of a form of like ADHD, is that what you call it, that has seemingly gotten worse as I've gotten older. So I get distracted very, very easily. So I try not to look down at the comments too much while I'm doing the show because I will be prone to be distracted by them. However, I did notice a comment just as we were beginning the show today. Spencer Clark says ESPN is disrespecting Georgia again. Now, totally believe that there are moments in which if you're a Georgia fan, you're like, I don't know that I've gotten my just due from ESPN. I think you'd be well within your rights to feel that way. However, I believe I know what Spencer's referencing here. It's probably related to, what we've stated as our topic for the day. And I don't know that what we're about to discuss over the next couple of minutes can be easily dismissed as ESPN disrespecting Georgia. I don't think it can be summed up quite that simple and disregarded that easily. What I'm talking about here is, and this happens every year, there are a few things that kind of take place. We kind of think of them as sort of our tent poles for the year of, well, this happens in this time of year, and then this happens, and this happens, and boom, enough of these tent poles, you kind of go around them. Eventually, you've kind of made your way back to the fall, and now the season's back here again, and all is happy and joyous because we love the football season. But in our kind of time, beginning of the calendar year, into the spring, into the summer, while we're waiting for the fall to arrive, there are a few things we sort of count on to sort of tide us over until we get there. One of these things is a guy named Bill Connelly, not super famous necessarily, but to a certain kind of college football fan, you know who Connelly is. Of all the kind of, and I don't mean this negatively, I just mean this, I guess, I don't know, sarcastically or whatever. Of all the sort of math nerd, calculator types, of all like the analytics, advanced stats, sort of the college football version of like what sabermetrics was for baseball, of all of those people, Connelly is probably the most, accomplished of all the sort of math nerd types when it comes to college football. He has a special analytics formula. He calls it SP+. Does it every year. Some people like it. Some people could care less. I think you're well within your rights to choose to care about it, choose not to care about it. But there is one thing that is an important part of the Bill Connelly analytics formula known as SP+, that I do believe is pretty important. It is what he calls returning production. Now, this is an evolution of a conversation that's happened in college football my entire life. It used to be many, many years ago, we talked about returning starters. And we've said this before. The problem with kind of looking at, well, how many starters do you bring back? At a place like Georgia, and a lot of college football plays are kind of like this, the word returning starter sort of means something different depending on kind of how you look at it. In other words, Georgia rotates a good bit at almost every position, even positions like, say, offensive line, where a lot of teams don't do a lot of rotating. Georgia sort of does. Certainly wide receiver and defensive back and, linebacker, they're kind of rotating and doing things a lot. So how much value is there really in being the guy standing on the field for the first play of the game? That's what would make you a starter if somebody else is almost playing as much as you are. And that's kind of where we kind of shifted in college football from talking about returning starters to returning production. In other words, if you're a defensive player, you're contributing to tackles, you're contributing to passes defended, you're contributing to a lot of things, sacks, tackles for loss, things like that. And so the contribution you made to that, what percentage of all of that returns for a given year? Offense, obviously, yards and things along those lines. And what Bill Connelly does, being kind of a math nerd type, and I think he would certainly admit that's what he is, being sort of a math nerd type, is he kind of weights the various things, receiving yards and quarterback passing yards and rushing yards. He sort of weights these things differently based on his own observations, and I won't get into the whole meat of that formula necessarily. But all of this kind of comes together of, okay, well, what percentages of the production you've had from a given year, what of those percentages is coming back for the upcoming year? And then he writes a big story at ESPN.com about it. We'll show you the headline here. You can go to ESPN.com and read this for yourself, especially if you're an ESPN Plus subscriber. College football top 25 returning production for all 136 teams. Now, the thing that sort of matters here is that Georgia is, according to this Bill Connelly formula here, among the least experienced teams in America coming back for 2025. That when you look at where Georgia ranks, returning production offense, returning production defense, Georgia's now one of the least experienced teams in America for the upcoming year. In fact, let me give you some of the numbers from the Connelly story here. That Georgia overall is 105th out of 136 programs when it comes to what they bring back from the previous year. 45% of the overall production. It's 41% on offense. That's 108th nationally. It's 48% of defensive production. That's 93rd nationally. So Georgia, not exactly a very experienced team. And while this is not necessarily a guarantee of how a team is going to play for the upcoming year, what Connelly will tell you is that when you bring back a lot of production from the previous year, starters along your offensive line, quarterback, things like that, then you are likely to have some improvement over the previous year. And if you don't bring back a lot, there is at least a probability that you might have some regression. Now, it's not always true in all cases. We'll get more into that in a moment. I know Connor Riley has written about that at DawgNation.com today, too. But this is one of those things I would take somewhat seriously. In other words, we've kind of had the hot topic a little bit about what about the coach of this, what about the coach of that, and I think many of you have heard me say, I don't know that situation is as concerning for me as it is for some of you. I take your argument seriously on that, but I don't know that I'm quite as convinced as some of you are about some of the coaching issues that Georgia's perhaps facing. However, on this particular issue, when you look at the fact that Georgia, after not exactly having a great, by its own standards, season a year ago, now has very little in the way of experience returning from that team, things get problematic. In fact, I want to read to you a little bit more from Bill Connelly here as a way of kind of accentuating that point a bit. He says, per SP+, that's his own analytics formula, Georgia fielded its worst offense in 4 years and its worst defense in its last 7 years. Now, Connelly says that sounds worse than it actually is. Georgia was still top 10 in offense, defense, special teams, according to his own metrics. But I think this is a very interesting description here. Many of you might agree with this. Connelly writes for ESPN.com, this was Kirby Smart's least scary Georgia team in quite a while. Doesn't that sound like a fairly apt description? Hey, very good. SEC champs, beat Texas twice. People have a tendency to forget that, but that did happen. But in terms of striking fear into the hearts of its opponents, would we say this Georgia team was less scary than some of the previous years, as Connelly describes them, I think many of us might say, yeah, Connelly might be sort of on to something with that. He goes on to say, okay, understanding that, you got to replace starting quarterback, 3 of the top 4 pass-catching targets, and 12 of the 18 defensive players that play 200 or more snaps. So all of this gets summed up by Connelly this way, who says, hey, losing a ton of production from your first 3-loss team in 6 years does not immediately signify that a rebound is incoming. So there's Bill Connelly, I think, striking a fairly dire, I don't want to call it a prediction necessarily, but it should be perhaps taken as a word of warning that there are a lot of people who are hopeful, and I'm certainly in this category, a lot of people are hopeful that Georgia is better this upcoming season in 2025 than it was in 2024. And I think there are legitimate reasons for all of that to be true. But Connelly says, hey, you just lost 3 games and you have not done in quite a while, and all of a sudden now a lot of the experience from that team is now gone. If you're expecting things to be way better in 2025, you might not get what you want. Now, Connelly may be wrong, like all of us, he frequently is. However, it is at least something that we should take seriously, that the challenge of being better in 2025 than you were in 2024 is made more difficult by the fact that you don't have the same starting quarterback, no matter how you felt about Carson Beck. You've lost a lot off your offensive line. You lost a running back like Trevor Etienne. You're losing wide receivers who played a lot of snaps for you. Defensively, you're saying goodbye to another trio, probably of first-round picks. All of that is really, really challenging. Now, after having said all that, now let me kind of pivot to the more, I guess, sort of positive assessment of this, which is at a place like Georgia, this is the kind of thing this program has dealt with before. So my point, and it sort of sounds like I'm probably talking out of both sides of my mouth, but my point to you is I do believe you should take this seriously, that no matter how you care about the analytics or the math nerd stuff, the notion that teams that bring back from a percentage standpoint very little in the way of their production from a year ago, they have a deck stacked against them in the current season. I do believe you should take that seriously. But at a place like Georgia, it is perhaps uniquely equipped to overcome some of that experience deficit. In fact, this is the sort of thing that Kirby Smart has talked about plenty. Let's go back to last May. Smart with Paul Feinbaum at the Regions Tradition Golf Tournament that Smart's always a part of. By the way, that tournament's going to have a new sponsor this year, so we won't be calling it the Regions anymore. But I guess now that it's not Regions, you wonder if Kirby's still going to go, but that's a different topic for a different day. The point is, Smart with Paul Feinbaum talking about the fact that, hey, no matter what you bring back, no matter what you lose, at a place like Georgia, this is a program built with sustainability in mind. Here's Kirby Smart.
We'll be the favorite in some people's eyes. Some people find things wrong with us. We got a really hard schedule. We play 3 top 15 teams on the road in our conference. That's tough. But we've got a good football team. We've got a very consistent football team. We say it all the time. We're built to sustain at Georgia. We don't want to be a one-hit wonder. We don't want to live and die through the portal. We want to grow our players from signing with us, make them better, and then give them an opportunity at the next level and to be better contributors to society. So I don't think we're going to have a good football team next year. I don't know how good, and I don't know how we'll play on some really tough road games, but we'll see where it falls.
So that's obviously an assessment from Kirby going into the 2024 season, but I think you could take those same words and kind of make that applicable to 2025. In fact, when we hear from Kirby during the offseason, my guess he'll still say something pretty similar to that. And I think the statement that Smart makes at sort of the end there is the appropriate response to this notion of, oh my gosh, there are 100 and something teams in America that are bringing back more of their experience, their production than you're bringing back. Smart says at Georgia, no matter how much we lose, we still want to be built to sustain success. That means we want to bring in good players, box checked on that, another elite recruiting class in 2025. We want to grow and develop those players. That's the work that's about to begin when it comes to spring practice. And we want to unleash those players in college football so that they can make a name for themselves and then go on to the NFL the way we're about to see a bunch of guys do during the scouting combine this week. So that's what Smart would say about all of that. And I think that's true. But if you really are going to see Georgia overcome the production and experience deficit that the math guy Bill Connelly at ESPN says they have, then I think this comes down to three things you've got to do to mitigate against that. I'm going to run through these pretty quickly. Thing number one is this. For the experience that you do have, those guys have got to play very well for you. And in this particular case, while Georgia was going to have a new full season starting quarterback, I'm not going to count Gunnar Stockton as someone with no experience. He played a half against Texas, played a full game against Notre Dame. That, to me, is experience on a big stage. So that's a guy right now I'm putting in the experience category, even though it's very little experience. It's at least significant experience on the biggest stage of all. So that's a guy that you need to use that experience and really hit the ground running. Along with that, we're going to put a lot on a guy like Nate Frazier this year on this show. We believe that the sky could be the limit for Frazier overall, and making good on that, boy, it's time to see Georgia have a great running back again. A guy like Oscar Delp. We're going to do more on Delp, later on. That's another guy that's played a lot of football for you that kind of comes back having finished last season playing some of his best football of that particular season. Good rapport, we believe, with Stockton. That's a guy that you need to have a big season. Experienced players need to play very well. If you don't have as many experienced players as some other teams are going to have, the experience you do have, those guys have got to play well. You can say the same thing on defense. For guys who've been here, taking that next step and kind of following the footsteps now of what Georgia's done, replicating success defensively over and over and over again. Conversely, while you need your experience to play well, you need some of your newcomers to step up. Georgia signs elite classes year after year after year, but for some of those young players, not always easy to find their way on the field. You sort of wonder now, though, as it seems like the balance of talent around the sport is kind of spreading out a little bit more. We believe that creates more opportunities for young players. So young players stepping in and thriving, doing a little bit like what a KJ Bolden did a year ago. Bolden was great at that. Need more guys that are able to step up right away and kind of sort of meet the moment. Smart has said before that if you're good enough, you're old enough. Well, Georgia needs some of its young players to be good enough, to be trusted, and to kind of fill a role that perhaps in the past would have been filled by a more experienced player. That world doesn't really exist for Georgia or maybe anybody else in college football anymore. Time for those guys to step up and do it. And then the final thing is this. I think back to the last time that Georgia had really significant questions about what it needed to replace and who it needed to kind of step up and fill in gaps and things like that. And, you go back and hear guys talk from that 2022 team. A guy like, Jamon Dumas-Johnson, I remember him, who was obviously would eventually leave Georgia, but was a part of that 2022 defense, a defense that had to replace 5 starters that had gone on to become first-round picks. And at one point in time when Jamon was talking about, the need to replace all that, the word that he used was hungry. I remember this from a story going back a couple of years ago. He said, hey, listen, we lost a lot. This is before the year began. We lost a lot, but the guys who are ready to step up are hungry for their moment too. And I think that hungry can be a word that can have some real value for Georgia this upcoming season. On the one hand, when you don't have a lot of returning production, the ESPN numbers suggest that they don't. When you don't have a lot of returning production, that creates a void that needs to be filled. But it also creates some hungry football players who want to fill that void, who are ready for their moment. And that can provide its own level of energy. And maybe for Georgia, that's what we get here for this upcoming season. A lot of players looking for their time, their moment, ready to kind of provide a new, fresh spark for Georgia. If that's the case, that could certainly be a very fun thing to watch here in 2025. My name's Brandon Adams, and this is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented today by ServPro. We're glad you're with us today, whether you're coming to us live on video at 10 a.m., radio, Athens Sports Radio 960 The Ref, podcast, Apple, Spotify, all those platforms. By the way, I will tell you this. I know we've had another little issue as it relates, I believe it's to our Apple podcast player. And the thing that frustrates me about that is, of all of our platforms, that's the one that is the absolute oldest. It's been with us the longest. We've loved that one for a long time. But it's also kind of our problem child here for right now. So here's what I'm going to tell you. We are working to get that fixed. We are working to make improvements there on that, and I do believe we'll have some news for you on that soon. It's one of those things we'll fix it, and it'll kind of mess up again. The shows are not loading on time the way they're supposed to on Apple. Seems like they're doing fine on Spotify, but they're not doing correctly on Apple right now. So if you're normally an Apple podcast listener and you're like, boy, things seem like they've been a little bit weird lately, they probably have been, and that's something we've been trying to work through here. So we're going to hopefully have a full and final resolution for you on that here coming up. But we do want to let you know that we are aware we've had a little bit of an issue as it relates to that, and we are working to get that fixed. We appreciate your patience on that. We also appreciate our friends at ServPro who make today's show possible. Listen, our folks at ServPro do great work for you when it comes to something really, really important. If you, the home where you live in, or perhaps if you own property for like warehouse, commercial or rental property, something like that, let's face it, there's always a chance that some damage can be done to that property. You may have fire damage. You may have water intrusion. You may have, all kinds of just any kind of things of that nature. If you have a mess like that needs to be cleaned up because a fire broke out, because a water pipe bust, or anything along those lines, let the restoration specialist of ServPro do great work for you in getting your property restored back to its previous condition, getting it looking like it never even happened. That is what ServPro is all about. Also, every ServPro franchise independently owned and operated, so you can certainly know that you're doing business with some folks who have a real interest in making sure you get a satisfactory outcome. That's what they're all about. So don't hesitate to reach out. If you find yourself in kind of a emergency situation, messy situation, you've got property damage by fire, water intrusion, or all the other things that can kind of create these gigantic messes, let the restoration specialists from ServPro do great work for you. You can find them online. It is servpro.com. That is SERV, servpro.com for more on that today. All right. We had a lot to do with you. It is Jake Fromm here coming up in a moment. It is Connor Riley in just a couple of seconds. So two great guests today. Before we bring on Connor, though, I do want to follow up on a story we talked about yesterday as a part of Around the Doghouse here, and that is new information as it relates to Jared Curtis, the five-star quarterback. We learned yesterday that Curtis is now down to Georgia and Oregon for his services. And the one thing I mentioned on yesterday's show is, if you talk to people who kind of know somebody who knows somebody who knows somebody, I think the sense that you get is that wherever this is going between Georgia and Oregon for Curtis, we may not have to wait forever to find this out. This may be done by the early part of the summer, late part of the spring. There is sort of a growing sense that could be the case. We've seen these sort of, like, say, June commitments from quarterbacks before, of course. And to kind of give more information as to why that might be true, that Curtis might be ready sooner rather than later to make a decision, let me give you this new information from a guy who's been kind of all over this from the beginning, Hayes Fawcett, who has, relationships with all these guys because he makes a lot of the graphics, and so therefore when they're ready to make a graphic, they reach out to him. That means he gets a lot of the inside scoop. So Fawcett reporting on X yesterday that five-star quarterback Jared Curtis has locked in spring visits to his two finalists. He says the number one quarterback in the 2026 class is going to visit Oregon March 8th through the 12th, and then Georgia on March 13th through the 16th. So if you're a Georgia fan, perhaps you take some comfort in the fact that Georgia gets the last of these two visits. Maybe that's the case. But also beyond that, what I find interesting is it gives us a chance to really make an evaluation of two things we sort of discussed yesterday. Thing number one, we believe, like any sort of battle like this right now, obviously NIL going to be a big factor for Curtis. Georgia's made some announcements recently about kind of a restructuring of the Classic City Collective and how they are, hopeful that their NIL can kind of provide additional sort of over-the-top revenue payments for players, even in kind of a revenue-sharing world. There's still going to be a role for NIL to play to kind of give a quarterback like Curtis the financial value he feels like he's worth. We have kind of maybe thought in the past that Georgia has been outspent a couple of times for recruits in the past, whether Georgia was just choosing to be judicious or because somebody else just had more money available to them. However you want to describe that, we think there are recruiting battles that Georgia's been a part of where the other side has spent more money than Georgia was either willing to or able to spend. But where does Georgia's NIL prowess kind of stand when it comes to a player like Curtis? We now know, because of the fact these visits will take place in March, and you presume the commitment could come soon after that, we might not have to wait very long to find that out. Also, as we've said before, it's been such a hot topic, throughout the entirety of this calendar year of where things stand with Georgia and its offensive coordinator Mike Bobo and the Georgia fans who are unhappy with him. And as we talked about yesterday, Paul Feinbaum taking notice of that and essentially doing a complete sort of about face on his program, or I should say his opinion on Bobo, and all of a sudden now sort of echoing the criticism that Georgia fans have expressed of Bobo. Well, if you kind of want to have a little bit of an early referendum on Georgia's offensive coordinator, the decision that Curtis makes could be certainly an example of that. That for people who think that Bobo is problematic, a strong refutation of that point of view would certainly be Jared Curtis saying, hey, I want to be at Georgia and I want to work with Bobo. In the past, he's told our Jeff Centel, our DawgNation recruiting insider, that he's got a close relationship with Mike Bobo and Montgomery Van Gorder and the rest of this Georgia offensive coaching staff, that if in a few weeks here, in a couple of months here, if Curtis really does kind of pull the trigger and make that Georgia commitment, then perhaps it shows you, as we discussed yesterday, that Georgia's NIL efforts actually pretty strong here as we kind of move into a new landscape of the sport. And Georgia's offensive coordinator, Mike Bobo, maybe not fully popular with all Georgia fans, and maybe some of that's with good reason, but perhaps still incredibly popular with the constituency that matters most. A five-star quarterback in the class of 2026 may be an example of that. So very, very interesting times here. And we may not have to wait very long on the basis of these visits coming up in March. We may not have to wait very long to find out where things stand with Georgia when it comes to five-star quarterback Jared Curtis. And that is Around the Doghouse here today on DawgNation Daily, presented by ServPro. So with all of the twists and turns out there about that, want to get ready to keep that conversation going. Now, later on, we'll have Jake Fromm today. Speaking of quarterbacks, that's always a lot of fun. But for now, it's Connor Riley here today, DawgNation Daily, presented by ServPro. Let's talk to him here right now.
From Athens and across the SEC or wherever the recruiting trail may lead, here's a DawgNation.com insider.
Certainly an awkward transition right there. Had to reload the batteries there for a moment on the pack. Connor, great to have you here. Fun to have you as a part of DawgNation Daily, presented by ServPro. Hope you are doing well. If you do not mind, let's jump right into the conversation we're just having. As it relates to five-star quarterback Jared Curtis, I find this to be very interesting, primarily because of how accelerated this story expects to be. Can Georgia compete in this sort of money game that we're in now? Well, certainly a win with Curtis would suggest that Georgia's more than competitive when it comes to this kind of stuff. And as we've been saying, for all of the, I guess, issues that perhaps Mike Bobo is facing in the eyes of some Georgia fans, boy, in a few weeks, if you're looking at a commitment from Jared Curtis to Georgia, that seems to sort of fly in the face of something being, irrecoverably wrong with Bobo as offensive coordinator too. Where do you think kind of things stand when it comes to what's next for Jared Curtis and kind of what this means for Georgia based on whatever decision he eventually makes?
I am fascinated to see how this is going to play out for Georgia, because this commitment in particular, I think, extends beyond what we have seen in the past from five-star quarterbacks in the past. It's all right, you're going to pay enough money. I think Georgia would be willing to do that in this situation and spend big with Oregon. But the thing moving forward, and the thing to keep in mind, and as Jeff Centel, I think, wrote about in his story this morning on Jared Curtis and talking about that decision, we talk so much about investments, in terms of NIL dollars, and with the House settlement coming down the pike, if you're going to spend big at this quarterback position, you're going to have to play this guy early. And so the type of money that is going to have to be invested in Jared Curtis, I think, would say a lot about how Georgia views Curtis as a prospect and what they might be willing to do moving forward. Because I don't think that you're going to be able to win these big-time recruiting battles paying the top dollar that you're going to have to, and then sit players like this for a few years. And this doesn't just limit itself in scope to Jared Curtis. I think moving forward in this NIL world with what they're paying for freshmen, for what they're paying for top recruiting classes, they're going to have to get a better return on investment early. But if Georgia wants to spend top dollar to get Jared Curtis, which I believe that they will have to do, I think that the commitment doesn't just extend to what it says about Curtis, but also how quickly perhaps they're willing to get him onto the field. And so I'm fascinated by what they elect to do here, because Georgia's got big recruiting needs, not just at the quarterback position, but at the offensive tackle position as well, which figures to be a very expensive position, especially in this cycle. And so I'm very interested in seeing what Georgia elects to do with Curtis here, regardless of whether Curtis ends up choosing Georgia or not.
Yeah, I think there's an interesting kind of counterbalance to that, which is, okay, if you look at Ohio State this year, they won the national championship. We're led to believe that the NIL value for a guy like Will Howard was actually pretty affordable by what seems like today's standards. There are reports out there that maybe he was like $1 million guy or something like that, not multiple millions of dollars. And while he didn't have a very good he didn't have, let's say, a great regular season, he was outstanding, I think, in the postseason. So you could say, hey, we'll just go out and we'll kind of make a sort of a bargain purchase of a quarterback through the transfer portal, and we'll find our own version of Will Howard. But the problem is, if you look at what's in the transfer portal, it's not obvious who the next generation of Will Howard is. I did not think the transfer portal crop this year was, frankly, all that outstanding. So I guess to be as good as Georgia wants to be, how much do you think Georgia needs the blue chip quarterback coming out of high school, given – frankly, the sort of, I would say at times, unimpressive crop of quarterbacks available in the transfer portal?
It's interesting because, and this is what I kind of wrote about on Monday. Georgia put a lot on the shoulders of Carson Beck last year. I think they wanted him to be their best player. I think, and this is a phrase you hear used in the NFL a lot, they wanted Carson Beck to be a force multiplier, and he just wasn't. And I think if you go back and look at recent national champions, which Georgia aspires to be, Joe Burrow was the last time that a quarterback was the best player in a national championship team. And I would mind you that LSU team had Jamar Chase and Justin Jefferson on the outside as the two best wide receivers right now in the NFL. So I think when you spin this forward in terms of how teams look to build, and I think Ohio State's a great example here. Will Howard was a good quarterback. Stetson Bennett was a good quarterback. But they found a way to get great quarterback play out of them, especially in those big moments. And so moving into the sort of, I think, Moneyball era of college football, where roster construction and how you spend on your rosters is going to be under much greater scrutiny, I'm very interested in seeing how Georgia elects to do and move those finances around and how they choose to prioritize that. Because I think that this is something where, again, if you're Georgia and you want to build out your rest of your roster, they won in 2021 and 2022, not because of the quarterback position, but because they had overwhelming talent elsewhere. We know moving forward in this age in college football, it's just going to be harder to accumulate overwhelming amounts of talent. And so it's going to become, I think, a lot more difficult in terms of nailing the guys that you go out there and scout. And you have to absolutely crush the guys that you're going to get and pay big dollars to use a fantasy football reference. It's really hard to win your fantasy football league when you just get absolutely nothing from your first round pick. So if Georgia's going to spend big to land the blue chip quarterback, like they're going to have to do some cycles, they absolutely need him to produce right away and come in and play a big role for this team. Because if you're spending that much money on a guy that's not contributing, that money thus doesn't go elsewhere. And the opportunity cost there when Georgia is competing for national championships like they are is simply just too high.
Yeah, my personal opinion is I don't hate the idea of Georgia having the Stetson Bennett-style quarterback giving them money to spend on other players, or the Will Howard-style quarterback, once again, giving them money to spend on other players. I don't hate that idea. But is it fair to say, because Georgia went hard after Arch Manning, went hard after Dylan Raiola, seemingly is going hard after Jared Curtis, that no matter what I may think about, hey, the sort of bargain quarterback might actually work out pretty well for you, Georgia seems to think it needs the blue chip quarterback. And if you went hard after Dylan, didn't get him, if you went hard after Arch and didn't get him, does that put pressure then on Georgia to get this guy, given the fact they've probably taken the silver medal now a couple of times for what we think of as the sort of five-star blue chip style quarterback?
It certainly starts to add up in that regard. And I think when you look at the quarterback depth chart right now, Gunnar Stockton, he's got 2 years of eligibility remaining. And so when Curtis potentially comes, or whoever the 2025 or 2026 rather quarterback is, Gunnar will have just 1 year remaining. There's no one else on this Georgia roster that has thrown a pass to this point in their career. And while I like Ryan Puglisi a lot in terms of the athletic tools that he brings to the table, I do think that there are some major questions there. And so I think in this class in particular, it does line up well, where if there's going to be a year where you go out and spend big and you get a guy that can come in and play multiple years for you, you probably want him to sit just 1 year and start that second year. We've seen that follow through a couple times. Tennessee this last year, with Nico being the most obvious example. And so, there's a path here where Gunnar wins the starting job this year, which I think most of us expect. Gunnar comes back for his senior season, and then you have Curtis redshirt for 1 year. That's as close to a clear timeline as you're going to potentially get, to where you can hit on a little bit of development while also still retaining the best bang for your buck in terms of what you were paying a top prospect quarterback. Whereas, if they had Arch Manning, it would have been a little clunky there with Carson, and Dylan Raiola, would have been an interesting quarterback competition there. I'm not sure how he's doing after his idol Patrick Mahomes got blasted in the Super Bowl there. But I think with Georgia, I'm super interested to see how this Curtis thing plays out, if they're just willing to go to the mat and say, hey, we're not losing this recruiting battle, because I know Oregon offers a lot. Georgia still recruited better than Oregon every year since Dan Lanning has gotten there, and Georgia still has some inherent advantages over Oregon, and I believe that they're going to use those in this recruitment there to try and land Jared Curtis.
You wrote an interesting story today about the returning production stats that Bill Connelly put at ESPN.com. I have a little bit of a love-hate relationship with some of the analytic stuff, but I do value this particular number percentage, and Connelly uses kind of a weighted formula that makes it more complicated, but the percentage of what you did a year ago statistically that you bring back for the current year. Probably a better way to talk about this than just simple returning starters, which is a little bit of a loaded phrase sometimes. And the fact that Georgia is among the least experienced teams in America for 2025, based on what Connelly writes, 15th out of 16 in the SEC, for instance. I do take that pretty seriously. Now, I thought you did a really good job this morning of kind of laying out why that doesn't have to be like a death knell for Georgia necessarily because of the talent the program has. But I think it does speak to the significant challenge for people who want Georgia to even be better in 2025 than it was in 2024. The lack of experience, quarterback, offensive line, wide receiver, losing another 3 first-round picks off the defense, that lack of experience does make it more difficult, does it not?
Yeah, because they've got to answer some questions, but I think they've shown time and time again that they're capable of answering them. And I'll ask you this question, BA. Which group of teams would you rather be grouped with or grouped around? Florida, Texas A&M, and Auburn, or Oregon, Ohio State, Texas? Which of those teams would you rather have Georgia be grouped with?
It'd be the last 3, of course, yeah.
The last 3, like Georgia, were all listed in the most likely to regress category.
Yeah.
Those first 3 teams that I mentioned were all in the most likely to improve category, which I'm sure some fans would love to see Georgia be. You know what those first 3 teams have in common and those last 3 teams have in common?
What's that?
The first 3 don't compete for national titles in the last decade, whereas the last 3 very much do. Right. Oregon maybe notwithstanding at this point in time, but they're certainly up there, and they were undefeated through the regular season this year. And so I think that's where Georgia has to exist. And, yes, there are questions about what they have to replace, but I look at this team, I look at this roster and the way it's made up. They need to get more out of their true freshman class this year, certainly than they did last year. And they need to get more out of last year's freshman class, which are now moving into their second year. 21 of the 28 guys on their team that signed in the 2024 recruiting class ended up redshirting last year. And so, yeah, you're naturally going to have a lot of experience there. Kirby Smart knows far more about football players and football than I can ever hope to learn. He forgets more in a day than it does with that. I think we've seen time and time again that he develops players better than anybody and can do that at an elite level. He's going to need to develop these guys and do it at a rate quicker than maybe perhaps he would like entering this 2025 season. But I think that the key to this team, it is going to be with those younger guys who just frankly haven't produced a whole lot yet. And so this is one of those things where the math doesn't help and support Georgia in this game. But last I checked, football isn't played on spreadsheets. It's played out there on the field with the Jimmies and Joes. And I trust that Georgia has better Jimmies and Joes than certainly 104 teams in the country, and a good bit more than that as well.
So I completely agree. I think the overall premise is 100% right, that when your talent level is high enough, the experience you bring back from year to year might not matter quite as much. I think that's 100% true. However, there are counterexamples when, as a fan, I have kind of leaned on Georgia's overall talent level, and the lack of experience did become an issue. I think about 2019 wide receiver, for instance, 2023 defensive line, for instance. There are moments when you were sort of counting on, hey, the talent that Georgia has is going to rise up and kind of mitigate against the lack of experience. There are examples now in what is about to be Kirby Smart's 10th season where it doesn't always work out that way.
Right. And it's not, for me, a team-wide issue, but rather, and I think you do a great job of pointing this out, a position-specific issue. I think that edge rusher right now certainly would seem to fit in that bucket. Now, I would say traditionally, Georgia hasn't gotten a ton of production out of that edge rusher position, and so maybe it might be mitigated against some of that. I think running back is another position that is worth mentioning there. We all like Nate Frazier. I had to change a bold prediction on Friday because you and I gave the same one, that Nate Frazier is going to top 1,000 yards.
Okay.
But I think both agree Georgia's going to need something consistent behind him. And I don't quite frankly know who that guy is right now. I know what Cass Jones is, and I know what he brings to the table. They're going to need someone more, something more than what Cass Jones gave them in 2024. So I think there are certain spots on this roster where you look at that and you wonder, okay, how are they going to get by there? Can they do that there? But, at a position like quarterback, and I've written this pretty consistently throughout the offseason, I don't expect Gunnar Stockton to be a better quarterback than Carson Beck in terms of what he brings to the table. But I do think that if Gunnar's able to limit his turnovers and he's able to play a little bit quicker, I think the talent around Stockton, on paper at least, is better than what Carson was dealing with for much of the 2024 season. And I think that could help the Georgia offense play better as a whole. And so again, to reiterate your point, there are certain spots where, yes, that is a question and concern. But inside linebacker, to use Conley's formula, they're losing a lot with Jalen Walker and Smile Munden and having to replace that. But you've got Chris Cole and Justin Williams, who played a combined, I think, 140 snaps last season. You take what those guys can potentially give you every day of the week and twice on Saturday going into this 2025 season, and certainly over a lot of other teams and what even I think they return at the inside linebacker position.
There is certainly more we could discuss, but we'll leave it there for right now. Connor, love all of your coverage at DawgNation.com. Appreciate your insight on these topics as well, and we'll look forward to getting a chance to speak to you very soon here on DawgNation Daily, presented by ServPro as well.
Yep, as always, it was a pleasure.
Let's take a look around the rest of the league. This is SEC Through.
Good stuff there with Connor Riley. Sorry about the delay at the beginning of the interview. We're not done, though, with great guests on the show today. It's Jake Fromm here coming up in a couple of moments, too. Prior to that, though, let's get ready to go cruising around the SEC, courtesy of Royal Caribbean. And a little bit of warmer weather today makes me kind of think about being in the Caribbean and how much fun that is, this time of year, moving towards spring. I think the spring is a great time of year to be on a Royal Caribbean cruise because you get the sunny weather, you get the warm weather, you also get a nice little coastal breeze every now and then, a little tropical breeze, tropical wind kind of blowing through there. You love that. Perfect day, Coco Cay, great place to be when it comes to all that. The over-the-water cabanas there, the Hideaway Beach, the adults-only enclave, the Oasis Lagoon, largest freshwater pool in the Bahamas. So many fun things to do when you're at Perfect Day Coco Cay, and the only way to get to Perfect Day Coco Cay is on a Royal Caribbean cruise vacation. So Jessica Slater, the one to talk to, she can get you set up and ready to go here in 2025. Give her a call, 770-718-9147. That's 770-718-9147. You can also email her, jslater@dreamvacations.com. She'll tell you all about it. All right, before we get Jake Fromm, let's bounce through a couple of SEC Through stories here. Cruise around the SEC, courtesy of Royal Caribbean. Brandon Marcello, writer, CBSSports.com. I like this stuff this time of year. Has his coaches in the hot seat for the upcoming season. A couple of SEC names get mentioned by Marcello. Hugh Freeze, Brent Venables from Oklahoma. Now, let me say this. Starting with Venables, first of all, I know we're kind of getting used still to Oklahoma as an SEC team. I think the issue here with Venables is one of the great defensive coordinators we've probably seen in recent college ball history. But is this a head coach? Is this a guy that can kind of fully make that transition to being a head coach? I would say the jury's still out on that. And And, frankly, I don't quite know how this year is going to go for Venables necessarily. I thought they'd be better a year ago. They turned out to be. So it could very well be that Venables is just not quite cut out for a job the magnitude of Oklahoma, especially given the pressure of kind of being in the SEC. More coaches will likely be fired in a more rough and tumble version of the league. Venables may certainly suffer from that. The Hugh Freeze part of this, though, I find to be slightly more interesting because, while obviously most of us are big Auburn haters as Georgia fans, the truth is I do expect Auburn to be among the more improved teams in college football here this season. When you talk about that sort of thing, Connor mentioned that before. And the fact that we really haven't seen the sort of breakthrough yet from Freeze at Auburn, I think some of that is related to the fact that, they've tried to go into the transfer portal. They've tried to bring in kind of big talent, and it hasn't always been there. They've had money to spend, transfers trying to bring them in, but they haven't always found them. I think this year could be a year, though, which they probably had a little bit more success in the portal than maybe they've had previously. I think the Jackson Arnold, ironically enough, could be an example of that. Arnold had been at Oklahoma. So here we have two coaches sort of fighting for their job. If Freeze takes Arnold from Oklahoma, a guy that Venables, of his own choosing, decided to bench, and if Arnold goes on to Auburn, if he wins that job over, the hotshot freshman they have, Knight, and if he becomes that guy, then that may be the way in which the Hugh Freeze saves his job, and that may be the ultimate, I guess, conclusion for the Venables tenure. If it really does kind of work out that way, we may see kind of play out there in that fashion. So bottom line is, Venables, he may be done. I'm guessing that Freeze probably does something to keep his job. Speaking of coaching jobs, see where Florida has now promoted Russ Callaway, one of their assistants, to offensive coordinator. We won't get into this a ton here right now, but this is pretty good drama for those of you who kind of like the SEC soap operas. When Billy Napier was retained as the Florida coach after DJ Lagway had success, kind of at the end of his freshman season. When Lagway had that success, when Florida played better, I think the understanding in Gainesville was, at least according to a lot of people around there, that Napier would give play calling over to somebody else, and if you do that, you can keep your job. Well, lo and behold, here we are, getting ready to move towards spring practice, and that's not what's going to happen. Callaway's going to get the offensive coordinator title, but ultimately, he's not going to be relinquishing the play calling. He's still going to, or I should say that Napier's not going to be relinquishing the play calling. The belief here is that Napier is still going to be that play caller, and Florida fans are not happy about this. Now, this also comes a year after there was a lot of controversy last year about who was calling the defensive signals for Florida, too, after Austin Armstrong sort of kind of fizzled out after a lot of hype when he first got hired there. So if you want to talk about hot seat, Billy Napier's certainly a guy that could be on that hot seat. And for a guy who really needs improved play from Florida here this season, gets another tough schedule, the drama with his assistant coaches is one of the things perhaps standing in the way for him there. And we'll kind of see how, as a play-calling head coach, using a very talented quarterback like DJ Lagway, if they can provide the improvement this year that Florida fans want them to have. I was going to do something on the Texas in the spring game thing. We've talked about that. We'll get to that later on in the week. For now, let me just say that's cruising around the SEC, courtesy of Royal Caribbean, and get ready to bring on, without further ado, Jake Fromm here as part of a Kroger Fresh Take on DawgNation Daily here today. Jake, always appreciate your time. Good to be back with you. I missed the chance to speak to you last week, but glad to be speaking to you right now and hope you're doing well. Good stuff there from Jake Fromm.
Hey, glad to be here, Brandon. Thank you for having me. Hey, we missed last week, but excited to be here today.
Yeah, no, I'm really happy you're here right now, too. So one of the things I wanted to talk to you about a little bit, and Connor Riley and I were discussing this a moment ago, that we're kind of moving into in sort of the compensation world of college football, and you live in this world in the NFL. It's like however much money you sort of pay your quarterback, that's just less money than you have to pay other people. So you can be like the Kansas City Chiefs. You can give, deservedly so, Patrick Mahomes $8 gazillion, but if you do that, you're going to have to go a little cheaper somewhere else, whether it be a wide receiver or guys on defense or whatever. You've got to make tough salary cap-related decisions. You can pay your quarterback less, and you can kind of have a more balanced roster. NFL teams have been doing that for a long time. It sort of seems like we're about to kind of move into that world in college football where, hey, you may have a quarterback that ranks as the most expensive players in the sport, an Arch Manning or someone along those lines. But if you do that, at least for most programs, you may have less NIL dollars or revenue-sharing dollars to spend other places. I guess my question to you is, as a quarterback, how much of I don't need specific numbers here necessarily, but how much of a necessity is it for you to have quarterback being like, among the most expensive, among the, the best in the country? Or can you still win with like a Will Howard style player, or maybe what a Stetson Bennett would have been, the sort of quarterback that maybe is not your most expensive NIL player that gives you a chance to sort of spread that money around the rest of your roster? Which of those two, I guess, formulas do you think is going to work better for college football moving forward, and perhaps Georgia in particular?
Yeah, I mean, this is like economics 101 with all the different trade-offs that you're going to have trying to build the best roster that you could possibly build. Personally, I think what has worked in college football for a long time is having really good teams and having really good players kind of obviously throughout your roster. Yes, that makes a lot of sense. But basically kind of like your quarterback being that last piece to put you over the edge, right? To me, going all in on a quarterback and paying him $1 gazillion, I don't see that being the recipe for success. Now, a lot of teams will try to do that, and they will have to do that. They want to have that quarterback kind of basically go and elevate those guys around them. But to kind of go maybe the San Francisco 49ers route, for example, of drafting real well and getting the most out of your drafted players, and kind of building such a good roster, and then that quarterback being the line. I think it's been tried and true for a long time, what Alabama and Georgia has done for a while. When you played, it was obviously the pre-NIL era, but you've certainly been in your share of locker rooms. You're in NFL locker rooms now. I think the fear that some fans have, and I think that some coaches have expressed some concern about this too, is how the really high dollar guy, if you bring in a quarterback out of high school and he's making supposedly millions of dollars, or, if your, veteran player gets a chance to cash in and he's the one that's making millions of dollars, that the presence of that financial imbalance creates problems in a locker room. How true do you think that is? I have not seen that in my own experience. The two really high-paid guys that I've been around have been Jared Goff and Josh Allen, and both of those guys have been phenomenal teammates. Like, they're the best of them. So there is no envy, there's no jealousy there when it comes to those two guys in my particular experience, because those guys are all about winning. They're all about elevating the team and doing whatever it can to help the organization win. So in my experience, no, that's never been an issue. Because the truth is, if you grow up playing sports, hierarchy is the sort of thing you sort of get kind of comfortable with, right? And that's just a fact of life. I mean, some guys get a chance to bat leadoff, some guys bat the bottom of the order, some guys are starters, some guys are backups. And if you're going to be around sports, you sort of learn how to make peace with that. So even if you're playing at Georgia in kind of a pre-NIL world, you can look around the room and just based on how guys look, you sort of know, well, this guy's going to be a first-round pick, and this guy's going to have maybe a chance to play in the league, and this guy's going to sell insurance. Like, you sort of know who is what, and being around sports just kind of means being comfortable with those sort of hierarchies, right? Yeah, I mean, 100%. I mean, that's just part of playing ball. Obviously there's competition there, and you want to strive to get better. And if you don't like where you're at, man, compete, work your butt off to try to move up the depth chart, the pecking order, whatever you want to call it. But, man, that's just sports. There's just a lot of respect that comes with how well you perform on the field. Just part of the game. I think you and I probably talked about this before, but now we have more information. Like Texas is now joining, I guess, Nebraska. I think USC is now. This proliferation of canceled spring games. I think this is really sad, Jake, because I love Jeter. Go ahead. I am so glad you brought this up. I feel very opinionated about this. I absolutely hate it. I hate it for two reasons. One, we could talk about the fan side of things, giving an opportunity for fans to get a different experience of a game. Maybe some less fortunate be able to go who don't get season tickets. That whole thing offers a different experience that way. And then two, from the player side of things, the preseason, let's just take the NFL preseason, for example, is very important for the fringe players to be able to go play, compete, and showcase their skills. So for me, the kind of comparison to a spring game being like an NFL preseason to me is almost identical. So if I'm a player, I want that spring game. I want to go out and perform, show the coaches, one, on this team and on this roster, I deserve to be able, to move up the depth chart. Or two, I want to show the rest of the country, who's also going to be watching my film off of this game, that, hey, if I maybe for some reason can't earn a starting position here, that I can earn a starting position for your team and for your program. So I think this is super important. I really hate that a lot of teams are missing out on this opportunity, and a lot of players are missing out. So I don't like it. I'm so glad you brought this up. I feel very, very strongly about this. And I think from a player perspective, I would be very upset about this if my coach, my team, my university is canceling the spring game.
So I want to follow up on this because I think you're bringing up a really good point. And selfishly, as you said, it's fun for fans because it's just a chance to be between the hedges. The weather's usually nice. I totally agree that it's normally either a very cheap ticket or a free ticket. So for families who, gosh, now these tickets are $1,000. If you're going to these, games during the regular season, that's really, really expensive. So this is a great way for families to sometimes go. So I have a little bit of a selfish motivation around that too, because I like that opportunity to exist for people. But in order for them to continue, there does need to be some value for the team. It's got to be one of those things of, the spring practice leading to the spring game does make the team better. Do you believe those practices, that time for development and having that kind of come together in something that feels like real football, do you think the teams themselves actually benefit from those spring practices? It sounds like you do.
To me, if you go about it like it is a legit fall football game, then yes, there is a lot of good to come from it, a lot of experience to come from it. For a lot of freshmen coming in early and early, like I was, that's the first opportunity, man, to be in that stadium with a lot of folks around. So you get that feel, you get that environment. So when it does come fall and you're hosting your first, SEC home game, there is no deer in headlights type of feel and effect, and you try to mitigate that as much as you can. For a lot of the fringe guys, to give them a chance or a leg up or an opportunity to move up in the depth chart, to me, I think this is huge. Like I mentioned a second ago, quarterbacks, to give yourself a live rep. I think spring games are huge for quarterbacks. It was huge for me when I was playing. Especially as a freshman coming in, I think having that spring game experience helped me in the fall of my freshman year. So I think there's a lot of good to come from it. And then Kirby, the way he kind of goes about this spring game, it is dead on like a fall football game schedule, and he keeps it as legit as possible. And to me, it's brilliant. It's the way you got to do it. It's the way you got to operate. And doing everything first class.
All right, we respect your time. I got one more thing I want to ask you, but before that, let me remind people this is our Kroger Fresh Take here with Jake Fromm on DawgNation Daily. We love having Jake on the show, and we love our friends at Kroger, and we love what they can provide for you when it comes to a chance to become a member of Kroger Boost. So you're already spending money at Kroger. You're buying the things you need for your family. Why not earn twice the fuel points for the things you're already getting at Kroger anyway? Now, normally you get a fuel point for every dollar you spend at Kroger, but when you're a Kroger Boost member, you get 2 times the fuel points for the stuff you're buying there at Kroger. You can also take advantage of free delivery, free pickup, super convenient, great way to save money. Kroger.com/boost for more on that. That's Kroger.com/boost for more on that. All right, Jake, quick final question for you. There was a thing yesterday where, and sometimes this happens, these coaching clinic videos sneak out, and there was this one where Kirby was sort of joking about Johnny Manziel doing like fireball shots or something like that. The whole thing was sort of a weird deal where he was showing all these former Heisman Trophy quarterbacks that had success against the Alabama defense, and it turned into, Manziel champion of doing fireball shots and not anything else. My point, though, is that, this is the way that I think that Kirby talks with other coaches, and I think the average fan doesn't probably realize this about how funny some of these coaches are behind the scenes. Whether it be, Kirby with Georgia players. I've heard this from Alabama players when it comes to Nick Saban. I think Bill Belichick was this way too. That these coaches that have this very almost like a Army general type demeanor in press conferences and on the field, stuff like that. Behind the scenes, when it's just coaches sitting in a room together or sometimes coach to player, that coaches actually are a lot funnier than they probably get credit for. You've been with a lot of coaches, Kirby included. How funny behind the scenes is a coach like Kirby in a way the public typically does not get to see?
Meetings sometimes, man, you got to kind of spice the meeting up a little bit. It gets monotonous, and a lot of coaches that I've been around have a phenomenal sense of humor. Now a lot of them are a little dry, a little ruthless sense of humor, like Kirby alluding to that coaching clinic video. But man, Kirby's got a great sense of humor, as a lot of coaches do in college and the NFL. Just part of the nature of the business comes with it, and you have to be able to laugh at yourself and others too at times. So it makes it fun, it keeps it light, and it's to me, I think it's really needed.
Jake, I always appreciate your time. Thanks so much for everything. By the way, your background looks great. You got that settling in and looking really sharp there. Thanks for being here on a Kroger Fresh Take with us. We'll hopefully get a chance to speak to you very soon.
Thank you. See you next week.
Yes, sir. Some good stuff there from Jake Fromm. If you're watching on video, Jake telling us 2 weeks ago, he's kind of working on his little background there. I guess that's down in his basement. You got the Fromm jerseys, the various NFL helmets. Kind of some cool stuff to be able to see from Jake on that. Kind enough to share that scene for us, and obviously his thoughts and time there. We love all that. How about a golden shoe here today? Our buddy Thad Stokes writing in to say he was repping the Dawgs, the Daytona 500. For 2 rain delays. This, by the way, came in while I was gone last week, so we're kind of catching up on some older golden shoes, by the way. He says it was 2 rain delays, nearly an 8-hour race, but looking good with the G there. Family looking good there, too. Hashtag Daytona Dawgs, hashtag golden shoe. Thad, we love that. We'll certainly give you a golden shoe for that. When it's all said and done, you saw a very entertaining race, even if you had to wait a long time for the conclusion. But it was an entertaining race, if not slightly controversial, but good stuff there. Lousy, stinking Gators, same state, but nowhere near as enjoyable. How about 1,571 days? That is how long it's been since the Florida Gators have beaten the Georgia Bulldogs. That is why they are the lousy, stinking Gators in our mind. That is our Gator Hater Updater. Y'all have a great day. We will see you back tomorrow. DawgNation Daily, presented by ServPro. We'll look forward to talking to you soon. And on video, time now for our R.S.Andrews cool down. R.S.Andrews, when you turn to for your air conditioning, heating, plumbing, and electric needs. They show up on time. They do the work that's promised, the price is promised. You can trust them on all of that. We'll get your comments here and find out what's on your mind. Of course, we appreciate you being with us. Good stuff from Jake Fromm today. Good stuff from Connor Riley. Looking at all of what's going on out in the world right now. As Georgia gets ready for spring practice, you got some big-time recruiting stuff here coming up very soon. So a lot to discuss. Let's see if I can get into the comments here. There we go. Now we're going to get in here. We'll do some YouTubes. We'll do some DawgNation.com, some Facebook. We'll have a good time. By the way, Wilbur Barnes checks in. Will says he loved Utopia of the Seas. Will, I am so glad you had a good time on that. I think it's a great ship. And I love the fact that they're kind of offering brand new ship like this, currently the newest of all the ships for Royal Caribbean, offering this on those 3 and 4 night sailings. Because, Will, I don't know if you're like me, but, we're just in kind of a place with our family right now. The idea that we can kind of get away for a 7-night cruise. Now, listen, I hope to be doing that again really, really soon. But right now with 2 kids, both heavily involved in sports, my wife's working again. We've obviously got a lot of stuff going on around here. Getting away for the 7-night cruise is not always an easy thing to do. But the long weekend that Utopia provides, the 4-night cruise that Utopia provides, that's the link of our DawgNation cruise. I think that's an awesome getaway. And to have a ship like this, because the tradition in cruising going back, say 20 years ago would be your older ships or your less, prominent ships. Sometimes those are the ones that would be the shorter cruises. But for Royal Caribbean right now, they're making a major investment in like Wonder of the Seas, for instance, is about to become a short cruise ship for those down in South Florida. They're putting a lot of the newest and nicest of the Oasis class ships as the shorter cruises. I think that's great. Well, I'm glad you had a great time. All right, let's see what else. Jerry Dogfan said, did you see that Dejon Edwards signed with the CFL team? I did not see that, but I do know that the Canadian Football League can be a great way to make some money, a great way to make a living in the game. So good for Dejon Edwards. That's awesome. G. Graves on the subject of Ellis Robinson. We talked about Robinson a little bit, in one of the shows while I was gone. I do think that Robinson's moment could be coming up, and I do think it's challenging playing at Georgia as a freshman. And and a lot of programs are also doing that, not just Georgia too. But it is challenging doing that, and I think a lot of folks thought, I think incorrectly, that because he wasn't playing, that somehow Robinson was unhappy. But if you have a chance to hear him at the end of the year the way that we did, you didn't get that sense at all. Now, I also think a guy like, say, DeMello Jones is going to be an incredible competitor for playing time here too. But the moment for Ellis might be ready to arrive. Alan Hampton says, do we have more major injuries to running backs other programs seem to have? Yeah, I don't know. Obviously, it seems like Georgia's dealt with a lot of that. I do believe that running back is an oft-injured position. We probably have a tendency to sort of, fixate on those in our mind a little bit more because they're happening to our favorite team. But, yeah, it seems like there are certainly a lot of those for Georgia. And, obviously, one of the things that we'll be hoping to hear with spring practice approaching is good news on Branson Robinson, perhaps, good news on Roderick Robinson, that these guys are kind of ready to go. Let me go to DawgNation.com again for a minute. We'll see how they're doing over there. Let's see what else. Oh, by the way, good to see DT in the comment section here. I hadn't seen DT in a little while. DT, I'm glad you're here. DT said he worked summer in Athens on a roofing company on a new construction project. He says every day, 100 degrees. Yeah, if you're up on a roof, 100-degree heat, he says any thought I had of dropping on a UGA went away right there. Yeah, that's real work. And a lot of these roofers also tell you, too, because I've known guys who've said this, that as you get a little older, for whatever reason, your comfort with heights starts to change a little bit, that when you're younger – you just be hanging off the side of a roof, doing whatever, no big deal. But as you get a little older, some people sort of find that their, comfort way up on a roof because, listen, you may think, two-story house, something like that, doesn't seem like that big of a deal. But some of these houses, the elevations are just, pretty high. And so for some of these roofers, they kind of lose their nerve a little bit as far as being up on a roof after a while. So that's real work for sure. That's real work. Let's see what else is going on. Good to see our buddy Brooke Dog in here there as well. He says now kind of in the next 4 out when it comes to bracketology. He says need to win remaining games, maybe one win the SEC tournament. Yeah, the problem with the SEC tournament is it's going to be a great event, obviously, deepest conference tournament maybe of all time. The committee in recent years has sort of shown not much in the way of willingness to kind of pay attention to the tournament as a way of, if an automatic qualifier steals a bid, then they'll have to acknowledge that. But teams playing their way in or out or up or down in the seedings when it comes to conference tournaments, we haven't seen a lot of that in college basketball in recent years. And, listen, maybe a miracle happened. Maybe Georgia will beat Florida tonight. But it certainly appears that Georgia has let its chance of making the NCAA tournament slip through its fingers. It certainly appears that way to me. And that's a shame. And some of that is, some of that is just due to the fact that it's a very tough SEC schedule, and in a kind of even in a tough league, Georgia's played a tougher schedule than some other teams have. Some of that is kind of a factor here, but at the same time, Georgia has had every chance to put itself into the tournament, and it's not losing to Auburn that kills you. It's not. It's losing on the road to Arkansas that hurts really bad. It's getting blown out by Missouri at home. That's not great. Letting one slip away against Mississippi State. That's not great. The losses to road game Florida and Alabama. Some of that kind of stuff is, 2 losses to Auburn. Some of that kind of stuff is easily understood. Those are just teams that are better than you. But, I think that some of the other games are ones in which, Georgia would have liked to have had and, not able to get them. Randy says, I worked in tobacco until my last year in high school, summers and long flannel shirts. Yeah, that's real work too. I mean, any kind of like crop picking is, talk about like, you got to like bend down and pick him up. That's real work. That's real work. That's real stuff. DT says he's been dealing with some health issues. Well, DT, we hope that you are going to be feeling better soon, and we're glad you're feeling good enough to be with us here today. Let me get some Facebook comments just for a moment. Okay, on Facebook. We'll see how people are doing over here. William Camacho says the Hoop Dogs are going to get the invite to the NIT. Yeah, maybe kind of going that way. We talked about CFL a little earlier. As Philip Jordan Wells pointed out, it's also the place where a lot of, what turned out to be great NFL careers sort of began. Guys like Warren Moon, Doug Flutie, they play in Canada for a while, then come to the NFL and become, huge stars. You also, when I was a kid, and I was pretty young during this time, but you had the USFL guys. Obviously, Herschel Walker, probably the most prominent to us. But what you also have, and I'm not quite old enough to have remembered the USFL, but there used to be a USFL card set. And I do remember that. Jim Kelly, Reggie White, obviously Herschel. Who were the other USFL guys that became big NFL names? Let's see what else. Ken Holcomb says, well, how many quarterbacks do you need on one team? The way players are hitting the portal now, all you can get. Yeah. Chastain Coleman asked about winning the cruise. Yeah, so there was a cruise winner. I have not been given the name to announce it on the show yet, but we need to do that, Chastain. But there was a cruise winner, and I believe the cruise winner has been notified. But I don't personally know who that is. But yeah, Kent was talking about quarterbacks, and I mean, it just sort of stands to reason you're going to lose some of your guys. But as Connor said, do you identify some players, young guys, that you say, hey, this is going to be my guy. We're going to build around him. We're going to sort of make him be ours. That becomes sort of an important thing. Mac Page, yeah, Steve Young, another USFL player. Thank you, Mac. Appreciate that. Gary Holt says Georgia softball's not lost, and Georgia baseball is looking pretty good. Yeah. I would say that Georgia baseball has gotten off to a nice start thus far this year. Softball team playing well. You love to see that. Love to see that. Or let's go through the other comments for a moment here. They're also talking about crop picking on Facebook. I mean, I don't know that labor-wise, especially if you're like what they call a stoop crop where you got to go low to pick it up. I don't know there is much harder work than that. That's real work right there. That'll make you a better person. All right, back on YouTube here for a moment. Let's see what else. Alan Hampton says, I assume that Gunner's going to be quarterback one, but his style is vulnerable to injury. Any chance of a two-quarterback system? So, as we've said before, when it comes to a guy like Ryan Puglisi, I think the hope that you would have for him is, as the season, I should say as the year progresses, heading towards the season, that he's developing in such a way that if you had to play him because of injury, that you'd feel okay in doing so. I would say right now that's not where things are. But your other point about Stockton and his style, if you'll notice, Gunner Stockton did not really run in the Sugar Bowl. And we've talked to Jake Fromm about this before. Jake saying that he didn't know that Gunner was really going to be a running quarterback. Stockton did run a lot in high school, but not really kind of like running away from people. A lot of this was sort of the Tim Tebow style of running, absorbing contact, and basically willing to take contact as a way of getting extra yardage. That's hard to do in the SEC. It's hard to do in college football, probably in particular, but especially in the SEC. Took a big shot, of course, against Texas in the SEC championship game. And it's just interesting that we really didn't see those kind of hits from him, in the game against Notre Dame. They just didn't really run him that same way. So it seems like that I mean, obviously you want Stockton's legs to be some part of what he does at Georgia. I don't think he's likely to be as much of a red zone running threat as, like, say, Stetson Bennett was. And, I do believe that Georgia is going to be careful about putting him in harm's way when it comes to running. Obviously not wanting to take the sort of big shots that he took, like the one against Texas, which is still probably the hardest hit I've ever seen. All right, let's see what else. Gary Roach says he got a chance to go to Disney World for the first time. I showed Goofy a new handshake. Well, there you go. Love taking the family to Disney World. I'll talk about this a lot. We go to Disney a pretty good bit. I do like taking the family there. It's always interesting. Crowds are usually pretty high around, like, President's Day weekend. There's usually a pretty big crowd there. That's not everybody's cup of tea, but we have had some really good times there. We've had some really good times there. So I'm glad you had fun. Craig Wade says getting these elite wide receivers through the portal and recruiting did help Puglisi's chance of starting. That kid can throw the football. Yeah, I don't think there's any chance that Ryan Puglisi is Georgia's starting quarterback this season, barring some sort of injury. Looks good throwing in videos. I'm not in any way disregarding your comment or disregarding Puglisi as a player. He may go on to be great, but I don't get the impression that he's close to being ready right now. Looks the part, as I've said on the show before. If you're casting a movie where you need someone to play a quarterback, Puglisi would do a great job playing a quarterback in a movie right now. When he throws it, he clearly looks like a quarterback, standing there. Just sort of the aura that he possesses sort of looks like a quarterback. But as of today, February 25th, 2025, Ryan Puglisi is not ready to start for Georgia or anywhere, probably in the SEC. Is he someone that you feel okay putting into a game before the year is done? That is a reasonable expectation, or at least a hope for an expectation that he could grow into being that. But I believe that there's a fairly wide chasm of difference in Gunnar Stockton's readiness and Puglisi's readiness. And I know where this comes from. I do get this. Once again, this is going beyond just what Craig said, is that people look at Gunnar and they were very happy with how Gunnar played against Texas. We warned about this. They were happy with how he played against Texas. But there is probably a little bit of an unspectacular nature to Gunnar's game. He's not going to throw the ball over the mountains. He's not going to run like Michael Vick. He's good, solid in a lot of areas, but somewhat unspectacular. And so, therefore, there's always going to be a little bit of a gravitational pull to what we haven't seen a lot of yet, in the hope that this guy's just more spectacular. One point in time, people were doing this with Carson Beck. There's always going to be that thought of, well, the guy we haven't seen must be more spectacular than the guy that's currently starting, because eventually you just come to recognize a quarterback's limitations. We think we're fairly, consistent on this. We didn't make too much of Gunnar when the whole world was falling in love with him after Texas, and we didn't get too down after, the offense didn't exactly thrive against Notre Dame. We have always been of the belief that the experience that Stockton was gaining at the end of the year was going to give him a chance to be a good, solid, capable starter for Georgia this upcoming season. He would not be my pick to win the Heisman Trophy, but I also assume that he's not going to falter and stumble and cause Georgia too much trouble either. I think he's going to be a good, capable starter, the sort of thing that Georgia typically has. But as a good, capable starter, that, in my mind, puts him well ahead of Ryan Puglisi right now. Spencer Clark says the Dogs finished at the bottom of the SEC in rushing. That's unacceptable. That is clearly an area they want to improve this year. Getting, a full season, for instance, out of a guy like Nate Frazier would be important there. Frazier's growth and development also as kind of a player important there. Better play from the offensive line is maybe the most important thing of all. Craig says, no, I get it. LOL. Yeah, listen. And I think that your comment's a good one. And some of this goes beyond just what you said, and I'm not in any way, down on your comment. But I do believe realistic expectations for Puglisi are really, really important. Really important. Alan McGovern says that Ryan's going to probably transfer after spring if Stockton becomes quarterback one and Jared Curtis commits. Yeah, I don't know. I wouldn't expect that to be the case. I really wouldn't. I wouldn't expect that to be the case at all. I mean, most players, not all players, but a lot of players, they're also aware of their need for development. It's when they come to Georgia. They want to be developed. And, if Puglisi were to, as you say, look around and say, well, Stockton's the starter and Curtis is coming in, therefore I'm going to, go somewhere else. I just don't, based on the very little bit that I feel like I know about, Ryan Puglisi, I don't really view that as much of a concern. I would say that Puglisi knows that the development he came to Georgia to get, that development's nowhere near done. And, honestly, for as good as Curtis might be, if he arrives in 2026 and Puglisi's been here for 2 years, I don't know that I don't favor Puglisi over Curtis at that point. Now, we'll see how it plays out. But, even if Curtis is the 5-star, and as Connor was saying, listen, you bring in a guy like that, you might feel the need to play him. But if Puglisi's now been in the system for 2 years, he could be a pretty tough customer in a competition no matter how highly rated a recruit Jared Curtis is. Let's see what else. Tina says that last week they stayed until almost noon. Man, there ain't no way they took more comments than I do. Now, we stayed almost noon plenty of times, but also, we got to get the radio show ready, the podcast posted. So we can't ever stay right up until noon. Plus, the big tech overlords, the algorithms, they don't love the super, super long shows. We have a tendency to get a little dinged for some of the really, really long ones. But listen, Tina, I'll put my interactivity, if that's even a word, my interaction. I'll put my interaction up with anybody's. Cody, did you really stay till noon last week? You didn't stay till noon, did you? Cody may not be listening. Texas Dawg says, I'd be happy to just see the quarterback have time to throw and the receivers catch the ball. Yeah, I know what you mean about that. Maybe this year they'll have more of that. Maybe that's the case. Oh, Tina, this is Tennille. How about that? Tennille using a pseudonym over at YouTube.
All right, BA. So we did stay pretty late. Was that Friday? It was Jeff and Connor and me. And as I'm interested, maybe some of the folks in the chat today were here on Friday. I'll admit I lost my cool a little bit.
Is that
Friday.
right? Wow, how about that?
Yeah, Kaylee threw it out there for the long finish. We wanted to do the Mount Rushmore of Georgia players all time.
Okay.
So it seems like a fairly simple enough. Okay, Kaylee goes first, goes Nick Chubb. No problem, Nick Chubb, damn good dog.
Sure.
Okay. Then Jeff, a little bit more out there, goes Jordan Davis. Okay, directed the band, he had a moment. So we've got half of the Mount Rushmore done. And then Connor comes in and drops Andrew Thomas.
Wow, okay.
And I lost it. I said, we hadn't even mentioned Brock Bowers or Herschel Walker yet, and we're almost through with the Mount Rushmore. So anyway, I kind of went off. But, yeah, for that reason, we had a very long and extended conversation, and we went pretty late on the cool down.
Well, there you go.
And I needed it to cool down.
Well, that sounds like a pretty fun one then. That sounds awesome. Well, so good stuff there on Friday. You always love that kind of stuff. And we've given our Mount Rushmore of Georgia here before. For me, it's Herschel, it's Brock Bowers, it's David Pollock, and it's Nick Chubb. And I guess my one controversial one there's probably Chubb, because you could make a case for others. But, man, I think that you look at Chubb's career, I think it's pretty underrated. And if Herschel Walker doesn't exist, for a program that sort of thinks of itself as kind of an RBU, now obviously you're less RBU if there's no Herschel Walker. I do get that. But I think that Chubb's the second best running back to have played at Georgia and a really, really important emotional leader. So, and we did this a couple of years ago, but our Mount Rushmore, and by the way, of all the things in the world that I have been wrong about, and my gosh, you could run a scroll that would last for months of things that I've gotten wrong, and in some cases very, very wrong. We don't deny that. Of all the things in life that I've been very, very wrong about, one of the things that it'd be hard for me to be more right about than I was, is identifying while he was playing at Georgia, early in his career, that Brock Bowers was going to be an all-time great player, that was in the midst of that all-time great career. So we had Bowers on our Mount Rushmore while he was still playing at Georgia. After the 2022 season, we already had him there. So we'll take a bow on that one for sure. Wilbur Barnes says he still loves Chubb. Yeah, me too. Really a great one. But people would make a case for like either Champ or Gurley. The reason why it's controversial is because you could do a Champ, you could do a Gurley, you could go back old-timey days to a Sinkwich. I mean, there are a lot of names you could mention. But yeah, my guy in that case would be Chubb. Yeah, and motivated, dedicated, since you could do Stetson Bennett, which would be in that category too. Yeah, C. Foster Moss is mad about it. I told you, the Chubb one's the one that's controversial. I don't think the other three are controversial at all. Herschel, Bowers, Pollock. I don't think they're controversial. I would say the Chubb one's controversial, but that's because there are probably a lot of players in that sort of next category that are close. You might can make a case for somebody else over Pollock, but those early 2000s years were very important years for Georgia, and Pollock was the best player on those teams. Ben Green says Roquan would be on mine. A different conversation for me would be, hey, who had the best individual seasons in Georgia history? And if you're doing that, Roquan had an unbelievable year. And if you're going to make like sort of I don't know if you call it Mount Rushmore, but honor roll of like the best individual seasons for Georgia, obviously that's Roquan Smith. But with all due respect, because it was sort of just the one season. He was a good player in 2016. He was a player at Georgia in 2015. That would probably make him below the Mount Rushmore level for me. But individual seasons, few have ever been better than he was in 2017. All right, let's do a couple of trips around the comment section. We'll get ready to go. Let me go back to Facebook here for a moment. Give them some love. Jim Sharon Caldwell got David Pollock. I would agree with that. Grady Darcy giving you a lot of names. Marshall Fleming says that Chubb never made All-American, so therefore can never be a College Ball Hall of Famer. That's sad. Yeah, the College Ball Hall of Fame is really weird. For instance, it's like every now and then they'll announce somebody getting in the Hall of Fame. You're like, wait, this person wasn't already in the College Ball Hall of Fame? So it's really strange, like how long some people have to wait to get in. Whether it be coaches or players, there are all these restrictions about what qualifies you. There's a winning percentage required to get in. Mike Leach just falls just below that. That's controversial. I know a lot of people around here have made the case for Irk Russell being in the Hall of Fame, but he doesn't meet the criteria based on a certain whatever. And obviously we would love to see him in the Hall of Fame. And then player-wise, you've got these issues to deal with too. It seems like you ought to just have it, open to be voted on. Now, I guess the one thing that makes college football different than, like, say, the Pro Football Hall of Fame is the sheer number of players who could be considered is far larger. Maybe they feel like they need the criteria to kind of narrow that field a little bit. Maybe that's the case. But generally speaking, we're not really all that in favor of, like, bureaucratic procedures. Chastain Coleman says we should do a Mount Rushmore of each position. I don't hate that. Ken Holcomb says at the expense of dilution, we need a larger Mount Rushmore. See, I guess we credit Bill Simmons, I guess, with the Mount Rushmore as a topic. I think Bill Simmons may have invented the idea of Mount Rushmore. I think it's perfect because I think 4 is a good number. I think 4 is a good number. 4 really requires you, whether it's Mount Rushmore or whatever, it really requires you to sort of whittle things down. So I do like 4 as a number for Mount Rushmore. Ken Holcomb also asking about the Canadian Football League. Yeah, Terrence Edwards made, I think, good money playing in the CFL. It's a different league, too. the field's longer. I think it may be wider. It's good for offensive players, I think. Let's see what else. Also, the subject of like DGDs. Matt Roof again bringing that up. Listen, there is no more. It's getting to the point now where I almost want to come in here and just start talking about partisan politics. Of let me tell you about this. Let me tell you about like I feel like there's less controversy around politics than like DGD type stuff. I feel like the DGD stuff has gotten somewhat controversial. And honestly, I think I've probably played a role in some of that, perhaps regrettably. So listen, I think, I don't know. It feels like this is one of those things that's sort of unique to Georgia. I don't know that other programs have their version of that. Maybe they do. But the whole notion of like DGD is getting somewhat controversial. Rodney White says that Gunner could be kind of a Connor Shaw type quarterback. And listen, for my money, that's not necessarily a bad thing. I think that Connor Shaw's a pretty good quarterback. Brian Whitaker checking out. Brian, we're glad you're here. Alan McGovern was also kind of asking about the transfer thing on Facebook. Yeah, I mean, listen, anybody can transfer at any moment, obviously, it seems like. But I wouldn't be too worried about that for Puglisi, I don't think. Ken Holcomb says, if it stops at 4, where do you put Trippy and Tarkenton? So this is where perhaps my own, I guess ignorance gets me in a little bit of trouble. But, Kent, you can tell me if I'm wrong about this. I look at Tarkenton as a far better NFL player than I do college player. That Tarkenton is obviously, historic former Bulldog, of course. But if you're ranking like all-time great NFL quarterbacks from certainly his era, but of kind of like the early Super Bowl era, he probably ranks higher on the NFL list than he does the college list, right? Am I wrong about that? Perhaps I am. My ignorance, maybe kind of coming through here on an era that sort of predates my own. In the case of Trippy, once again, I am, that's way before me, obviously, but my grandparents, both my granddads, were huge Trippy fans, big-time Trippy fans. And so, especially my grandfather on my mom's side, big Trippy fan. Told me all about him and, number 1 overall pick, I guess, Chicago Cardinals, I guess, as they were known at the time. I think that Trippy is among the more underrated players from Georgia because Trippy did not win the Heisman Trophy. Sinkwich did. A lot of people tell you that Trippy was maybe just as good, if not better. But this is also a program now. Like, I'll make a comparison here for a moment, and we'll get ready to wrap up. Like, I'm a Braves fan. One of the things I'm really proud of, and like a lot of things with the Braves over the years of, okay, a lot of playoff appearances, they don't always result in World Series. That's kind of disappointing. Let me tell you what I'm really proud of. If you look at the Braves retired jerseys, man, there's not a dud in that group. They're all like solid. I know there's some historic major league teams, Yankees, whatnot. I'd put the Braves collection of retired jerseys. Like, there's not a utility man in that group. They are all just like bangers. All of them are solid. And when you see all those retired numbers, you're like, boy, that's a great history. That's a great history of great players. And a lot of those have been in my lifetime, which is really fun. Some of them predate me. Dale Murphy goes back to my childhood, which is kind of cool too. But so you look at that list of retired numbers, like, man, based on this metric, Braves are as good a franchise as almost anybody. Yankees probably the absolute best, but Atlanta probably as good as almost anybody else. So the point I'm getting to here is that so someone like, say, Charlie Trippy, for instance, based on my understanding of Trippy, boy, that'd be a really good candidate on a lot of programs, Mount Rushmore. Be a really good candidate for a lot of them. But gosh, all of a sudden now we're in 2025, and the Georgia history, it's just pretty impressive when you think about, kind of all of the sort of, Rushmore candidates that have been added into this in just the 21st century alone. Pretty impressive. Okay, so Jay Black is in here. 11 Braves retired numbers. 9 of them are Hall of Famers. I guess that would leave Andrew Jones and Dale Murphy as the only 2 retired numbers not to be in the HOF. So there you go. I also think this, and this is one of the things I got in trouble for the other day, because people get fired about this, is that like Mount Rushmore and stuff like that, that's obviously an exclusive club. By definition, only have 4 of them. The thing that I think people get aggravated with me about is, but I do genuinely believe this. I don't believe DGD should be an exclusive club. I don't. I do believe that, like DGD is not the Ring of Honor or the retired jerseys, although Georgia doesn't really do that anymore. DGD, I think some of you are DGDs. I would myself aspire to be one. So therefore, if I'm going to be in that club, and I'm presumptuous maybe to put myself there, but if I'm going to be in that club trying to, work to make Georgia, better than it was before I came around, well, it's clearly not going to be a short list of people. And so therefore, to me, if non-players could perhaps be considered among that, then the opportunity for many, many former players to be on there, I think makes sense too. In other words, the sheer number of DGDs, I would hope, number in the thousands, not the dozens, but the thousands. Whereas like a Ring of Honor, around a dozen or so. Retired numbers, around a dozen or so. Monuments, handful. Mount Rushmore, 4. But to me, hopefully DGD is numbered in the thousands. But that's not something everybody agrees with. This is kind of funny. What about instead of like your Mount Rushmore, how about your sort of UGA Supreme Court? Now you got 9. You got room for 9. That's pretty good. I think that's kind of funny. All right, a couple of final comments. We got to get ready to go. Let us see what else. Brodo Baggins, thanks for the kind words. I appreciate that. Tennille says she knows she's a DGD. Tennille, I think you're a DGD for sure. Let's see what else. By the way, Jay Shipe's now on TikTok. Let me tell you what a disaster that's going to be. Oh, my gosh, what a disaster that is going to be. Nothing good is going to come from that. I would say more, but I'm not going to. JC mentions Robert Edwards. So a few years ago, talk about turning into like a whole thing. And this was like Tony Barnhart, nicest guy in the world. We love Tony. He did this thing where I forget what it was even for. It may have just been on X, like just his own. He was just having some fun one day. So he did like top 10 Georgia running backs. This has been years ago. This has been several years ago. And that turned into a whole thing on the show. We talked about that for days. And I just like stuff like that. Like I am a sports fan. Sports fans like rankings and lists and like debates. And obviously none of that is compared to some other stuff, it's probably not that important. Some of this is also pretty difficult to ever actually reconcile. Like there is probably no actual true right answer on some of this kind of stuff. But it's just sort of fun to do. Sports fans just sort of sit around doing that kind of thing. And I remember the controversial thing about Tony. Like I said, this is years ago. Sometimes I sort of mark time by how many studios ago it was. This was like 4 studios ago. By the way, more on that later on. But the point is I don't think Tony had Robert Edwards in his list of top 10 running backs. And I think that's a big omission. And we did a whole thing on that. So at the very least, Robert Edwards, I believe, deserves consideration among the best running backs. And talk about underrated Georgia players, Edwards was certainly one of those. Jonathan Aaron says, on your next pre-recorded show, you can do a Mount Rushmore on offense, one on defense, Mount Rushmore of coaches in college football. Yeah, listen, I'm all about stuff like that. I think stuff like that's fun. All right, we got to get ready to go. By the way, DT says Andrew Jones should be in the Hall of Fame. I totally agree with that. I also believe, I think that, of course, I am the least objective person in the world when it comes to this, but I think that Dale Murphy's Hall of Fame, I think we've talked about this before, Dale Murphy's Hall of Fame candidacy, far better than it's given credit for. Far better. Back-to-back MVPs. UGA Marine also mentioning the Halls of Fame being a joke. Much like, maybe I'm just getting to be soft as an older person, but much like I sort of favor a non-exclusive list for DGDs, I'm kind of getting more okay with bigger Halls of Fame. Like, it used to be when I was a little younger, I was right there like everybody else in sports talk of, it's not the Hall of Very Good, it's got to be the Hall of Fame. And you got to make it restrictive to make it meaningful. That's one of the more prominent arguments when it comes to Halls of Fame. You got to make it restrictive and exclusive to preserve its meaning. I got to tell you, I don't necessarily feel that way anymore. I'm getting to be a little more okay with more expansive Halls of Fame. I was in Cooperstown this past summer. Many of you know that. And I didn't get to spend as much time at the Hall of Fame as I'd like to have. But I tell you one of the things that I really appreciated. I knew I would like the museum part where you kind of walk through and see all the artifacts. Of course, as a sort of a collector myself, of course, all those artifacts were going to be awesome. I knew that'd be the case. And that's the part I wish I got a chance to see a little bit more of. But we were just kind of a little bit rushed. I got to tell you, the kind of the, what do you call it, like room where all of the plaques are located, man, that was pretty meaningful. I got to tell you, I thought that'd be just like, okay, there's the plaques, whatever. I actually spent a good bit of time just looking at the plaques and, just soaking in the fact that this is the Baseball Hall of Fame. And I remember this guy from when I was a kid, or I, had that guy's baseball card. He's played before I was born, or whatever. And if there were a few more plaques in that Hall of Fame, I don't think it would make it any worse. I don't think anything would be suffered because of that. I appreciated the chance to remember, guys that were meaningful to the sport. I appreciated that. So we are way off the plot now, but I am more in favor of larger Halls of Fame than I used to be. UJ Marine says, for me, the Hall of Fame is simple. Can you tell the story of X, Y, Z without that person in it? Which I think is a great sort of like short synopsis. That, hey, the history of baseball, the history of football cannot be told without so-and-so. The problem with that, though, is that people have pretty faulty memories. They do, and memories fade over time. And sometimes the purpose of a museum is to remind you of things. Oh, yeah, gosh. Because if you go really look at some of these guys in baseball, especially because we just have more data around baseball, Baseball Reference as a website exists for this reason. It's just sort of interesting to look at baseball stats. You're like, oh, gosh, I didn't even realize that. Wow, how about that? That's kind of neat. And there's kind of a college ball version of that, too, where, there's some obvious, undeniable Hall of Famers. And those are the guys that sort of everybody knows. But, people have a tendency to forget. And therefore, preserving memories for guys so they don't get forgotten, I think is important. Let us see what else. Foster Moss wants to put Barry Bonds in. Yeah, I don't know. One of these days we'll talk about the steroid era. Like, I have complicated feelings with the steroid era. But that day is not going to be today. UGA Marine says a UGA Hall on campus would be cool. Yeah. Georgia just simply does not do enough of this kind of stuff. And I don't know. I have my suspicions as to why they don't, but I'll leave that alone. But either way, there just should be more. There just should be more stuff. Like, I've been lucky enough to go travel to major league ballparks. When I go to these places, I love to see the statues. I love to see the monuments. I'm a big fan of statues in general. We've said this before. I like cities that have a lot of statues. I think it's cool. I think that sort of remembrance of history is cool. And gosh, I mean, how many great, whether they're plaques or statues, whatever else, how many cool ones could Georgia have? Seems like a lot. Probably should do more of that. Maybe one of these days they will, but I don't get the sense that's about to happen anytime soon. All right, we're going to go for now. Good stuff. Y'all check out R.S.Andrews online, rsandrews.com for your air conditioning, heating, plumbing, electric needs. It's warm today. Spring is on its way. Get your AC unit ready for that. Air conditioning to keep you cool and comfortable all spring long. Find them online, rsandrews.com. And then we'll see you back here tomorrow for DawgNation Daily, presented by ServPro. We'll look forward to talking to you then.